Hello, everyone. This is Between the Lines for the Melbourne City of Literature, and I am your host, Astrid Edwards. Today, I am in Melbourne, otherwise known as Naarm, and I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and I note that sovereignty was never ceded. It is my delight to be speaking with Andy Jackson today. Andy, welcome and hello.
Hi, Astrid. Always good to chat with you and lovely to be here. I'm here on Jajawarren country in central Victoria and want to again acknowledge my indebtedness to the elders for their work they do in caring for country here.
Andy, I'm going to introduce you to our international audience, and I suspect you're going to be a little bit embarrassed by what I'm about to read, but I'm going to forge ahead anyway. Because I think this is I think that you have a spectacular CV and achievement. But essentially, we are recording in 2023, in May 2023. And Andy, in 2022, last year, you published your fifth collection of poetry, Human Looking. And of course, you've previously published many other chapbooks and individual poems as well. Human Looking basically took out all of the poetry awards. So you received the Prime Minister's Literary Award for Poetry, the Australian Literature Society's Gold Medal for Poetry, and the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry. For our international audience, that is a spectacular sweep of many of the awards for which poetry is eligible in Australia. So they're a big deal. But I would also say that Andy has been part of the writing and the poetry community for a very long time. Andy and I both co-teach at RMIT University in the Associate Degree of Professional Writing and Editing. And Andy, you have a reputation for being a wonderfully compassionate mentor to many beginning and emerging writers and poets in Australia. And to further embarrass you, I'm going to say that the students speak about you in reverent tones, and I don't think they speak about the rest of us like that way. So congratulations, Andy. In your own words, can you introduce the audience to Human Looking?
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. The way I always think about Human Looking is through the title. That's always been very important to me. It came very early. The idea really is that you can say Human Looking, the title, in numerous different ways. You can say it as human looking, as in someone that kind of looks like they're human, but perhaps might not be. I'm really interested in what it means to be disabled, what it means to be deformed, different looking, on the borders of what we expect as quote unquote normal. So I'm really investigating all that stuff. Of course, the other way to look at it, to express the title of the book is human, comma, looking. So it's really about, what it means, how we look. It's not just about the people who are other, but the people who are doing the looking. Sometimes the book is a kind of examination, but sometimes it's a mirror and it reflects back on the reader.
Andy, your poetry means a great deal to people. I have multiple sclerosis, which is, I'm not getting out of that anytime soon. And although at this point in my life, most of my disabilities are invisible, that is unlikely to remain true for the rest of my life. And I find a great deal of comfort in your poetry, but also excitement and an opportunity to think differently, or to be pushed and encouraged to think expansively about what it means to inhabit the body that I happen to be in. So personal, thank you for that experience of reading your work, Andy. Can you talk to us about what poetry means for you? And I guess there are two aspects to the kind of question I'd like to interrogate here with you. What is poetry and what does it mean to you? But also, what does it mean to you to be a poet and to be participating in poetry?
Yeah. Yeah, great. Thanks, Astrid. Poetry has been extremely important to me as not just as a writer and in my kind of life, but as a human, as a person. Um, I really got started in poetry because of the really vigorous nature of the poetry scene within Melbourne, the live poetry readings. So it has always been a case for me of, turning up to a venue, uh, reading poems in front of other people and getting that immediate reaction. So poetry has always been this kind of social, communal, political thing. It's not a kind of abstract, cerebral exercise. It's about how we engage with each other, how we share meaning, how we might kind of shift the perceptions of each other just slightly. So, I do still do a lot of readings, of course, in Melbourne and other places, but I also got addicted to the page and to what you can do with the visual shape of poems and what that might suggest about the human body. So I love the fact that, of thinking of a poem as a little body and as a shape, not just as an object, but as a kind of alive thing. So poetry for me is a place where we meet each other. So when I'm writing a poem, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to, I guess, open up a little door that allows people to meet another person. Yeah.
Andy, you're so articulate. Would you do us the honor of reading us a poem?
Yeah, absolutely. I find it hard to choose sometimes, so I'm just going to go with my mood. Um, the book Human Looking really does have a lot of light and shade, sometimes both at once. But for some reason, I'm just feeling like it's a morning for something, uh, because here where we are, you and I, it is the morning. So um, when I woke up this morning, it was still dark. So this is more of a darker poem. This is based on the myth of Sisyphus. Those of you who know that person, that character, because of what he did, he was punished and had to continually push a boulder up a hill only to see it roll back down again. And every day he would do the same thing over and over. It occurred to me somehow that this seemed like a kind of metaphor for what disabled people have to put up with. So this is called Sisyphus, deformed, looks back over his shoulder. The hill is everywhere beyond my front door, and what I carry can never be put down. It's hard to remember a time when this weight was separate from my body. Aware it's being watched, the skin grows quickly over a burden, hardens like a myth, but keeps its sensitivity. There's a constant hum in my inner ear, and my nervous system is awash with fatigue. The enduring task is to leave the house, practice the art of oblivion, as if that could deflect your attention. At least it's exercise or rehearsal for what I'm not sure. Am I lifting history? Your thoughts of me? The hill could be the entire human world. The hill could be my shame, steadfast and cumbersome. Each morning I wake spent, begin again, scale and descend, the steep face of my appearance. Who else clambers up this fateful inclination, assumes this otherness? At the summit, breathless, alone, all I can do now is take it in, the vertiginous outlook I never asked for. I have left these impressions in the earth. I will be followed.
Thank you, Andy. That is beautiful. And for those watching, I did not know what poem Andy was going to read. So thank you for choosing Sisyphus, because that is actually going to dovetail into my questions for you a little bit later about mythology and, why an Australian poet finds such relevance in you know, the Greco-Roman mythology. But before I get there, I'd like to kind of interrogate the idea of writing about the body and the experience of being human. That of necessity puts a lot of yourself on the page, and it does invite a conversation with others as well, because that is one thing that we have in common. We are all tethered to the flesh, so to speak, in different ways. So you write about your own experience, but in Human Looking, you are also reaching out across ages and time to other people and other bodies, sometimes very famous people, you know, people lost to history. How do you respect your own experience, but also, you know, the experience and representation of others?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I grappled with that a lot in writing this book. As I said before, I feel like poetry is a kind of space for people to come together, and that's in the writing as well as in the reading. What I find can very often happen in our contemporary world, but also through history, is that we put walls up between each other, and we think that either, especially when someone's disabled, we sort of think that they're so different that we would have no idea what that life is like. And to some degree, that's true. You know, there's many people's lives that I would find very difficult to enter into, and there are poems that I wanted to write that I can't write because of that fact, that it's too much of a leap. But I'm really interested in not just empathy, because, you know, empathy is a good thing to connect and to appreciate and to feel with, but going beyond that through, what would I say, affinity, perhaps, where you feel like you don't understand, you don't feel the same, but you connect with someone. There's something that you share with them. Or maybe solidarity, where it's like, well, actually, my fate is tied up with yours, so let's connect. So I'm interested in that approach, because yeah, look, I think as my experience of disability and of otherness is that when I was younger, I very much felt quite alone in it. So that's part of the motivation too, to kind of reach out and go, well, actually, and realize there are other people going through parallel experiences. And that's really interesting to me. Yeah.
I realized that because we are talking to an international audience, we might need to give some context for some of the language that we are currently using in Australia, Andy. So you just used the word disabled, which, you know, we both identify as disabled people, disability. We both appeared in a 2021 collection, Growing Up Disabled in Australia. Could you talk to the language that we are using in Australia? Because that, of course, is the context within which Human Looking is being read and has been received in a really beautiful way.
Yeah, thanks, Astra. And good point. So it's interesting. I have just been involved in running a project with various writers, collaborative writing. So getting people together to write in pairs or trios or whatever. And we've had to come to have this discussion about how do we refer to ourselves? Are we disabled writers? Are we writers with disability? Are we writers with mental health challenges, with chronic illness? So all the different labels start to come together, and there isn't any easy way for there to be one label that covers everybody, where everyone's happy. But that's the nature of things. I'm happy to talk about myself as disabled because for me, what I'm saying is that this is another way I like to put it, is that that society is disabling. So when I say I'm disabled, it's just a statement of fact about the impact that the way that our culture is organized and the way that society is organized, that restricts the sort of life that I'm able to live. It affects different people in different ways, but yeah, I think our culture and our society is disabling, and I think that happens kind of around the globe.
It does, Andy, and that was a lovely explanation. Thank you. Kind of going back to a question I asked you a little bit before, I'd like to interrogate it a bit more. Some of the poetry, individual poems in Human Looking, black art poems, or take a very real document or well-known thing in history. For example, quite invasive medical photographs from, late 19th century, early 20th century. But, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is in there, which is, part of the canon. You take these things and reinterpret them, bring them into the 21st century with, an interrogative eye, but also a really warm embrace, if I could put it that way. As a poet, can you talk to our audience about how you take such disparate things and bring them to us?
Yeah. When I first started writing this book, I think I was very, very interested in this idea of staring back. So people who are physically different are often experience staring. And so I had this question in my mind: how could a poem stare back at a reader or an audience? How could we shift that dynamic? When someone is staring at you, it feels intrusive. It feels kind of it's uncomfortable. And so I think what I wanted to do is go, well, how might a staring encounter work if it wasn't staring anymore? It was a kind of encounter within a poem. So I was thinking about all the different spaces in which that kind of dynamic happens. I think it happens very much within a lot of artwork, a lot of visual artwork where we're encountering other bodies. So I was thinking of all the different artworks that I've had that feeling in myself that seems to be happening. I was thinking about other stories of literature, other poems where that happens, historical situations where that happens too. So yeah, I think in a way I could probably write this book many times over because there's so many things that I didn't write about that I didn't get to. But it was very much a case of really wanting to see what we could do with this whole idea of looking.
Andy, I hope that means you have many more collections and poems to come. Kind of a question with that notice, but would you read us one of the poems that refers to Mary Shelley, which is, of course, Borne Away by Distance?
Yeah, love to. This one, actually, it's so interesting. I read this because I was in a workshop in Colorado a couple of years ago. I wasn't intending this to be in this book at all, but when I look back on it, it kind of made sense. Well, of course, I'm going to write this. So it just reminds me anyway that we write things because we're connected with other people, and yeah, this seemed to work. This is again this is an erasure poem where I've taken the last chapter of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and kind of extracted another voice out of it by crossing out almost every other word. So it's Borne Away by Distance. You may give up your purpose, but mine is assigned to me. I often thought, breathed, composed the burning of my own species, the task of my returning exhausted. I, this wonderful catastrophe, the remains of words. Gigantic in stature, distorted in proportions, this pause turning toward tremendous being. I attempt to speak, but the words die away on my lips. At length I gather resolution, groans of love and sympathy. Throw a torch into a pile of buildings and sit among the ruins. I hope to meet with unfolding. Believe the creature, sublime and transcendent. I am alone. You hate me, but cannot equal my being. That which must be. Ice raft, extremity, ashes, this frame torn by extinction. I shall exult in flames, the winds borne away by distance.
Andy, it is a completely new way to think of the ending of Frankenstein.
It's funny, when I first read that book I think as a child or a young adult, it was like, um, I think we probably all had that experience reading it, where the mythology uh, is this monster, but in reality, we know the monster is really the doctor, and we feel tremendously for the creature. It's a incredible book, and I suppose in a way I'm just sort of drawing out that sympathy and that anger and that isolation of that character.
I experience your poem and the reading that you just gave of the poem as almost a reclaiming of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because as you just said, the mythology, what we kind of the way we use the word Frankenstein in everyday discourse is very separate from the role Frankenstein plays and the role the creature plays in the story. Another question without notice, because I didn't prepare this one, but you've just inspired this in me, Andy. When we think about famous works of literature, part of the canon, or things that have, seeped into our general understanding, of what the English language can do, what have you thought about other works that might need a bit of reclaiming?
Ah, yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking this the other day that this is actually quite a hard book to write. And, it took years. And for me, I think I was partly a bit exhausted. It was sort of like, at the moment, I'm thinking of writing, well, I am started to write a collection of essays, and they're a little more discursive and a little more yeah, more really elaborating and going into detail and where I've got my ideas from. And so uh, I'm pulling back from this kind of work in a way, from poems, and not I'm telling myself it doesn't matter. I'll get to it eventually. So it hasn't occurred to me yet, but I think there are just many, 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 many things out there to work on. In a way, what I'm really happy about is that in the last 5-10 years, there's been so many writers with disabilities, so many other people coming forward that I'm really happy not to have to, do all that work. There'll be many other people writing those poems too. But that's
The industry has certainly evolved a bit in Australia, and I would like to kind of come back to that, Andy. But I would like to circle back to the imagery, the Greek and Roman mythology that appears throughout Human Looking. I confess my first degree was in classical Latin, and my first job was teaching classical Latin. So this makes me very happy. But also that means that I am hyper aware that, at least in the Australian context, sometimes people don't really understand. They understand the references a lot of the time, but they don't understand why it's still relevant to, us here on this side of the world in the 21st century. And of course, I'm biased. I think it always is. But I'd like you to talk through, you read a Sisyphus. There's another poem, Hephaestus. There are so many little references, and each time you use them, they feel new and relevant to me sitting here in May 2023.
It's interesting. When I first started writing poetry, I thought, who would write about mythology? Just seems so pretentious. And, things do change as the more you read and think and talk and examine this stuff. Because, obviously some of those stories are there in our consciousness as stories, aspects of the Sisyphus story. Aspect that I focused on is part of you can say Sisyphus, and most people kind of know what that story is. But even for a lot of the stories, the idea or the structure of the ethics, the lessons that they teach, have sort of become embedded in the culture, I think. And so the stories themselves may not be necessarily familiar to a lot of people or a lot of the detail of them, but we're affected by them still, whether we are aware of it or not. And certainly the case with a whole lot of texts, with biblical text, with all sorts of stories over the years. So I think if we can go back and relook at them with an open, kind of expansive eye, finding what's useful, what's also uncomfortable, we're not just looking at the text, we're looking at ourselves, we're looking at, the archaeology of where our stories have come from. So that's the most important thing to me.
This collection was published last year, about a year ago, give or take. In addition to winning many, many awards, you've obviously had time to, get responses from readers, from fellow poets, from people who have engaged with the collection. I was wondering, what responses are you getting? Beyond mine that I'm giving to you for free now, Andy. But I guess how is it being received, and is it being received differently within the disabled community than the broader reading public?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like there are many different audiences. I mean, this is the case for probably every poet, where we're read by our colleagues, we're read by fellow poets who are passionate about poetry. And I was so honored to get some really beautiful quotes for the book by some of my favorite poets. So that's really beautiful. But I think one of the things that has struck me is that, and any poets in the audience will know this, that I've had people say to me, I don't really like poetry, or I don't really read poetry, but I really connected with what you've written here. And it's, I find it really interesting, or it moves me, and I always find that so fascinating, because I think what I'm reckoning with this idea is so many people think that poetry is inaccessible, or it's difficult, or it's complicated. And at times this book it's not straightforward, but I think it's still accessible. You can access it. You might feel a bit disoriented sometimes, but you're able to enter into it. And I've that response of people feeling like they can enter into it and feel at home within it is just incredibly powerful. My favorite experience, I think, is just that, knowing that people, feel a bit less alone in their experience of their own body. And that, certainly is different from whether someone is disabled or not. Or, have maybe is not disabled and experiences some other kind of obstruction or discrimination or difficulty within their life, then I think they often get it in a way that I am surprised by, but shouldn't be surprised by. Yeah.
Andy, we have an international audience, and so I think, would you talk through kind of how poetry fits into the literary writing scene in Australia? And it hasn't always fit well. So I guess kind of what has been your experience maybe over the last decade, and what are you noticing now?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a really interesting, fascinating theme. Um, I think for a long time, Australia has been a bit embarrassed by poetry in terms of the public culture. When you tell someone you're a poet, they're often a bit confused. They think, oh, you can still write poetry. Oh, that's interesting. So that has been there for a whole lot of reasons. I think it, for whatever reason, it's become associated with being more refined or more intellectual. And of course, it's just the same level of intellect and weirdness as any other kind of writing. But it is shifting. And what I've noticed, I think, in the last 10, probably last 10 years, is I think in a way those who are writing poetry, those who are involved in it, those who are editing, are it's more diverse, and it's diversity is an easy word to say, but it's actually quite a profound shift, I think. Poetry is always always been lots of people writing it in Melbourne, but in Australia overall, it's been a really vigorous scene. But I think now there's something shifting in terms of what's getting published, and whose voices are being listened to. That's kind of raising our or shaking our sense of what poetry can do. So I'm noticing, I think one example is, and this is probably interesting in the literature overall broadly, is that the last, when the Stella Prize was set up, uh, they didn't include poetry as a book that was eligible to be awarded. This is the Stella Prize, which is for writers, women writers and non-binary writers. And I think 2 years ago, you might correct me if it's true, Astrid, but 2 years ago, poetry was included. And since then, it's been won by two women. So Evelyn Aralon's wonderful book, Drop Bear, and most recently this year, quick sudden mental blank, but you can remind me.
Sarah Holland Batt for The Jaguar.
That's The Jaguar, which is a astounding book as well. So that's, to me, it says something about what poetry is doing. A parallel thing happened with the Prime Minister's Prize when it was created in the early 2000s. They forgot to include poetry as a category. And then after much lobbying, it was included. And since then, of course, I mean, obviously there's been some fantastic books of poetry win that prize, and all different kinds of writers as well. There is now the idea that there will be a poet laureate in Australia at some point in the next few years, which I think is a sign that there's enough grassroots energy and vigor and diversity for us to feel like, actually, we want a poet to be able to talk to us about what's happening in the world at the moment. So, and I think Australians do want that. And we want many voices, and yeah, it's timely. Yeah.
I'm just going to swing back to the Stella Prize. So Andy, you were not eligible for the Stella Prize. You may very well have won it if you're allowed to be in that category. But yeah, Drop Bear and The Jaguar, poetry has only been eligible for 2 years, and it has now won 2 years in a row, meaning that, your traditional fictional novel is being beaten, essentially, to put it crudely, by poetry, which is such a shift in Australia. You mentioned earlier that Australia has a vigorous poetry scene, and you have always kind of been a part of that in terms of, reading your work and experiencing others reading their work. That in itself is a really kind of manifests in different ways, slam poetry, readings, spoken word events, etc. Can you kind of talk through that and maybe kind of the role it plays in finding new voices or finding diverse voices within poetry that are finally getting published in Australia?
Yep. I often think of, well, ideally all writing should be democratic, but I think poetry potentially is the most democratic. It's poetry as a form is really interested in the unique voice that each person can bring to it. So one of the things that, I mean, like I said before, I became a poet because I was able to get up in front of a microphone at an open mic, whether it's a blackboard or a piece of paper where you come up and say, could I read a poem? And yeah, they say, of course you can, we'd love you to. So you get up, you read your work, and so, maybe there's a polite applause. Maybe at some point someone comes up to you and says, hey, that was really good. You get these tiny little encouragements and you keep going. So yeah, publishing isn't like that. Publishing is much more, shall I say, competitive, or there's a kind of element of, there's just so much poetry out there and only a few are going to be selected. But if you live in a place where there are live poetry readings and many different kinds of levels, you mentioned the different forms that can take, and there's so many different kinds of readings. but whatever it is, if there is some kind of ability to have an open mic or a shared space, then there is an opportunity to have a go. And that's what, allowed me to be a poet. And I think that's what has allowed so many other people to be poets, that they've realized that, oh, they do have a voice. And also that as they speak, they get back, they sit down, they listen to other people, they absorb other kinds of voices, they start thinking about what they could change. It's it's a community, and that's just as important as the individual as well. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Andy, as I mentioned before, you are really well known in terms of, being a person who supports new poets, new voices, and you do teach at RMIT. I noticed that you are on the kind of advisory board of Sunder, which is a kind of new online only journal for disabled poets in Australia. The kind of brainchild behind it is Sarah Stevens, who is a former student of both of us. And I mentioned that by way of background. I'd like to ask you to kind of articulate how you approach helping others find their voice.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And hard to answer in that each person is different, that that phrase, finding their own voice, is so central, I think, for all of us who teach or mentor. Um, Very often, I think for all of us, every writer, especially younger, has a kind of inner critic, which is really cacophonous, really just tries to convince us that we don't know what we're doing. So I think what I try to do as a mentor and as a teacher is help people to kind of listen, um, to appreciate what they're doing, to realize that there's something worth pursuing, and also to kind of listen to each other and listen to other voices and pay attention to what excites them. Um, I was always, when I was younger, very intimidated by this idea that there was a canon and that I had to read it all, and that if I somehow didn't know, you know, a particular novel or a particular poet, then I was somehow uneducated, or not really part of the scene. Uh, it's a ridiculous idea. I think, in a way, I think what we need is people who read what they're passionate about and follow their sort of gut feeling. There's just so much good poetry that is within the canon and outside the canon and is in some other subterranean canon that we've never heard of. And I think people have to kind of find their own way through that. So yeah, it's about finding their voice and about expanding it, deepening it, evolving. Yeah.
Well said, Andy. I've just picked your brains about kind of how things work in Australia, but I would like to bring it back to your poetry and your collection, Human Looking. I am going to ask for a poem now. You've chosen two, but I have one I would like to ask for. Could you read the eponymous poem of the collection, Human Looking?
I'd be glad to. I was actually thinking about that this morning. So maybe, whether I sort of picked up on something that you had kind of pushed out into the world, I don't know. So, but yeah, I don't often get to read this. I'm really glad that you asked me. Yeah, this poem, the title poem of Human Looking, uh, comes from a book of historic medical photographs, um, housed in the Mutter Museum, and it comes from a book that I have of theirs. Uh, yeah, it's long-ish, and it goes through various different photos within the collection, and it doesn't include any names. Occasionally, it uses a capital letter. So partly it is about realizing and thinking about what we miss, what we don't know. Uh, there's always a balance in this book, and his poem particularly about getting right up close to these people, but also realizing that there's a lot that we don't know. And that's just as important. So human looking. So much can go wrong. Ulcers or lesions, an infestation of worms, measles, pneumonia, gangrene, some unidentifiable congenital flaw. Notice how the cursive of this young man's spine echoes the photographer's signature. This specimen was acquired in 1877 at a cost of $50 on condition that no questions were to be asked that might lead to its identification. I think about the word "it's." Through this contract, he became the world's second tallest skeleton on display. We are curious. So much can go wrong. Sudden multiple sarcomas, hysterical inability to stand or work or walk, vestigial tail, a body can be monstrous, shy, mercurial. This child's head is cradled by adult hands. It is difficult to discern whether this is for a sense of scale, the grip tender and subtle, or if he had to be held down for the image to be clear enough. I also need the inscription, supernumerary oracle, idiot, incontinence of urine, to believe there's anything wrong with him. So I look again. So much can go wrong. Unstable and fatigued, I am liable to fall into the belief that I'm not inside these photographs. Ara's hair is slick and neatly combed, crutches resting against the wall behind him. He is dressed only in a shirt and vest, pinstripe trousers folded so as to modestly cover his groin. I am meant to pay attention to the stump of his amputated right leg, the pinched flesh where the stitches were, hand resting in the vacated space. It's okay, he's looking into the distance, not the camera. How are we meant to look at all these injuries sustained from war, from motor vehicles, or from carrying wealthy men around on sedan chairs? And A's body is still here, naked and uncannily thin, bones loosely arranged on an unmade bed. The hard facts of his ribs and collarbone press up against his skin, against my eyes. Surely he must be sleeping, nestled in oblivion. Yet why is his bedsheet pulled back to expose him to the flinches and caresses of my gaze? So much can go wrong. Sometimes I might think I recognize myself in a patient as if their dignity or torment was mine. In this photo of a nameless man with an unspecified disorder of the jaw, he looks like he may be singing. Dressed in a tailored three-piece suit and tie, his expression is composed, almost bored, yet his mouth is an ecstatic, crooked O. No matter how hard I strain, I can't hear him.
Oh, Andy, thank you for reading that poem.
Pleasure, Q.
I know it's a long poem, but you said you don't often get asked to read it. Is that simply the reason?
Yeah, I think so. Sometimes as poetry is kind of slotted into a little gap, um, and also maybe I also don't always read it because of that fact that I might be given kind of 5 minutes, 10 minutes. You think, okay, do I read one longer poem, or can I read 5 short ones? Partly because I think the book is quite diverse, so it moves around to lots of different places, and I think I want to include multiple different things. So it's partly that, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a few kind of practical questions because I think prize culture is flawed and difficult in Australia and around the world. So noting that prizes are inherently subjective and flawed, but also noting that you won a lot of them. And I think that kind of overcomes the subjective nature a bit there. I wanted to ask, in practical terms, like, has anything changed for you? Is it, are you more likely to get a contract for your nonfiction work? I mean, how does it kind of work in Australia in terms of, supporting poets be creators?
Yeah. I'll say two things. One of the prizes that you mentioned earlier, the Victorian premiers, was actually won by Maria Takalander, who is a wonderful, wonderful poet. Her book Trigger Warning won the Premier's Prize. I got what's the word? Shortlisted for it. So
Andy, I'm so sorry. I am
don't-
so sorry. Obviously my
no, no,
research
no.
was a little bit flawed there. Maria Takalander is also a beautiful poet, everybody.
Yeah,
Also read Maria's
wonderful.
work.
It's a fantastic book. No, I just thought I'd mention that because it's happened a couple of times because for whatever reason the rumor has spread, so it's not your fault. But uh, yeah, I think it's affected a lot of things. You're so right about it being subjective and weird. Prizes are weird. I've been involved in choosing the winner of various kind of individual poetry prizes, and you do feel kind of that it's you and your co-judges. Of course, it doesn't invalidate any of that, but still, recognizing something that moves you very powerfully. It's affected me in a couple of ways. One, if I go down the street in where I live, I'm more likely to be recognized by strangers.
Well,
And
Andy, you're a famous poet. That never
yeah,
happens in
no,
Australia. I love
it's
it.
almost like a contradiction in terms, isn't it? So that's partly because of the prize, but it's actually part of the publicity that comes out of it more than the prize itself. Um, it's given me more space to pull back from paid work a little bit, which is not a small thing at all. I only really work part-time anyway, and I don't get a lot of time in which to write or to think or to just be human. So that's incredibly powerful. I think every writer deserves that. Every poet needs that space. It's unfortunate that there is that we do rely on prizes and grants and awards to get those spacious times. I wish poets and other writers got more of that. But I even think of, when I was shortlisted for the Prime Minister's, I then looked at the other shortlisted poets and went, oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about John Fulcher's book. Yeah, I want to go and get that. So we swapped books, and you're reminded because there is so much happening that a prize just gives a little bit more attention to that thing. So that's really powerful. That's important.
Is Human Looking published internationally, or will it be?
Um, it isn't. I do know that it has reached audiences internationally. I know that I have a few connections with other writers in America and in the UK. So it has been sort of sought out from people. So they've hunted it down. So yeah, that happens, but it's not explicitly published overseas.
I hope it gets published overseas one day, Andy. I have a final question for you, and it's to look forward in terms of what you might create. I know that you have said you're kind of stepping back a little bit from poetry at this point and looking to more explore the ideas around it in nonfiction. Noting that you're still in process, can you kind of give us a sneak peek of what might come for you?
Yeah. So the book that I'm working on, the book of essays, the working title is Hunches, Thinking Through a Body. So using this wordplay of both deformity or scoliosis, hunches, but also hunches, suspicions, thoughts, feelings, intuitive thinking. yeah, I'm interested in exploring the kind of gray areas and the weird undergrowth of um, where I've got my ideas from. So some of the essays will be about poetry and about writing, but a lot of the poems, a lot of the essays will also be about the body. Um, one of the poems that I've sort of essays I'm trying to write at the moment is about shame, because I think there's a real tension in disability community, particularly around people who do experience a huge amount of shame because of the way that the society is organized. And so we counter that with pride, which is a fantastic thing. But I've often felt like it's a bit too easy, that kind of leap. You just flip the coin over and there you are. Everything's okay now. I don't think it's that easy, and so I thought that when I first started writing this essay, it would be, you know, a standard length. And now the more I'm writing, the bigger it is. So I don't know when I'm going to finish it. But maybe that's the nature of things as well. And that's the difficult complexity of, you know, how do you make progress and feel okay in your own skin? What are the strategies around it, and what are we aiming for anyway? Like, yeah, uh, hard to describe, and that's why I'm in the middle of it.
Andy, that could be a whole book in and of itself.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's right.
Pitch that.
Yeah.
Andy, I want to really, really thank you on a personal and a professional level. It is always a delight to speak with you, to read your work and to hear you read work. So thank you for joining us today. Of course, for the Melbourne City of Literature and Between the Lines series. Thank you to those who joined us today and who will watch in the future.
Pleasure. Thank you, Astrid. Thanks so much.